Perfect. So again, we are working on analyzing our A through F results, our 2019 A through F results, because we know that those are going to be rolling over into the 2020 school year because of the physical closure of our schools. And we're going to do that with a protocol that's called the 33-minute data dialogue. I created this protocol with my team when I was in Scottsdale Unified School District, and have trained literally thousands of people to use it. And so the goal really is that you'll leave both on having a deeper understanding of how the A through F formula works, as well as how to interpret that data, so that you can actually make some meaningful changes to your practice or utilize that to determine next steps. So as we've got some folks coming in still to the session, I do want to have a little quick do now activity on the screen. Again, if you have your participant guide downloaded and following along, it's the first activity in this session. But just think about what's working well in terms of how you analyze and use data in this continuous improvement cycle process in your school or district, and what might not be working so well. What are you hoping that potentially you could learn some new tips or tricks or tools to address some things that could be improved. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to just think about, again, what's working well, what's not working well, jot those down, and then I invite anyone to feel free to share either of those two. All right, does anyone want to share what's working well in their system or in their school or district or charter in terms of how you analyze and use data? Again, if you want to unmute yourself, all you have to do is just hold down the space bar and engage in a quick little chat.
We seem to initially disaggregate the data really well, and then it kind of falls by the wayside.
Okay, so you're good at disaggregating the data, getting it down to the small subgroups or the groups of kids that we care about for maybe intervention or enrichment. But then after that, is it about, when you say it falls through, is it because of implementation, or you're not sure what to do once you've got the data disaggregated?
It's kind of one of those things, you start out of the gate really strong, and then as you get into your year and all of these other things are coming at you, you kind of not forget about it, but not pay so much attention to it.
Yeah, because there's 12,000 other things that are coming at you, and so that small piece of disaggregated data from the summertime is not necessarily the most present in mind. Thanks for sharing that, Patty. Anyone else want to share what's working well or what might not be working as well as you'd like in the way that you analyze and use data?
I can also share. I said something similar, but that we do a good job setting goals now with data. And then the difficulty is continuing a focus on those goals as the year goes on, and not getting too far away from the original goals. There's just so much that you want to do that it's hard to continue to just focus on what you knew was right up front.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of that is always a little bit of the competing priorities and things coming again at you, things that change. And there are times when it's actually perfectly fine to abandon a goal because it isn't working or it's not the right thing anymore, and set a new SMART goal and go forward. But hopefully we're assessing and evaluating and achieving our goals and kind of setting new SMART goals once we've done that. So the goal of the 33-minute data dialogue is actually to help address a little bit of all of those concerns that you're raising, right? It's creating a structure that is consistent and regular so that you can come back and have conversations about all of the data that you have available to you, and to reassess your goals, determine if you're accomplishing them or whether they need to be reevaluated. So hopefully this structure will help kind of address some of the things that you may want to improve in terms of your systems. So let's just, to reiterate, if you weren't on our pivot table session, there are some core principles that kind of guide the work that I do with school leaders, and that's teacher leaders, administrators, and district office folks. The first is the brain that does the work, does the learning. You are going to be engaging in deep thinking. Hopefully, you're looking at your own school's data, but if not, thinking through using this model and sample data so that you can translate that. We always want to start with the end in mind, and so the goal of the session is that you're going to walk away having some very clear understanding of the systems that you're being held accountable to, and how to use a tool and a process to better support the data analysis. We are going to walk away achieving some of those crystal clear learning targets that we're going to see in a quick second. And my goal for you is that you have a clear understanding of what success looks like. So how do you take the resources that we have available to you through the training and the materials and take that back to your school and your systems? So let's jump in. So before we can do the data dialogue, which we actually will be engaging in, we want to make sure that you understand the A through F mechanics, because just like with any good analysis of data, if you don't understand what you're looking at or how it gets calculated, it doesn't lead to really great action orientation. So we're going to make sure that everyone also understands the formula for the K-8 traditional model. But then we really want to focus on today thinking about what factors within the things that you have control over, curriculum, instruction, and resources, can contribute to the results that you're currently seeing, which also means that they can contribute to making changes to the results if you're not terribly happy with any of them that you're looking at. And then ultimately leaving with some action steps, because this is a very action-oriented protocol. We want to make sure that you have a to-do list. Hopefully that's not too long, but one that can be tackled as you go through. So just really quickly, I'd like you to just think about, given the objectives and what we want to accomplish today, what are you hoping to achieve in this hour-and-a-half session, thinking about data analysis and understanding A through F. So just jot down anywhere in your materials a quick intention for today. All right, so before we jump into the protocol, we want to, we hear a lot about this term data-driven decision-making. Sometimes, and oftentimes now we're hearing data-informed decision-making. And ultimately, it rests on the fact that you have a lot of information, and data is from a variety of sources. It isn't that kind of a four-letter word. Right, it really can be analyzed in an efficient and effective way. It helps when we have a common understanding of what that looks like in our buildings. So whether that's in our collaborative teams or grade level teams or administrative teams, whoever is coming together to have a conversation, having a common protocol helps, because then we've got some prior knowledge that we can activate and tap into as we keep doing it. The second bullet really is just, if it's not already obvious to you, data is necessary, but is not sufficient, right, to improve anything, student achievement, our own practice. So unless we can figure out how to take the information and translate it into meaningful actions, our behaviors aren't going to change. And ultimately, in the case of analyzing school data or student achievement data, those systems won't improve. So our goal is really to think about and hook into whatever systems you already have in place. Again, you may or may not be using a professional learning communities model, or you may or may not be using a multi-tiered system of intervention, an RTI model, but almost every school, grade level team, or group of teachers that I know get together on some interval and look at their information and try to figure out what does it mean and how can we use it effectively. So this protocol is really designed to fit directly into whatever systems you already have in place and actually improve and make them more efficient. So it isn't around replacing everything, but kind of for some of you might be making just some minor adjustments. In this particular protocol, this data dialogue, there are a couple of key pieces, and I'm going to take the role of the facilitator and the timekeeper today. But as you think about managing data conversations, it's really important that everyone who comes to the conversation really understand what the objectives are. And that comes only when we have good facilitation. So whether that is the principal leading a school-wide PLC conversation, or an administrative team meeting, or a lead teacher in their grade level, when we come to the table with data and information, we need to know what it looks like, what format it needs to be in, what data do we need to bring with us if we need to bring anything, and that really ultimately again starts with that facilitator taking on that role and communicating effectively. This particular protocol is not accidentally called a 33-minute data dialogue. It is 33 minutes because every single one of these sections is timed. So a good timekeeper is really essential, and one that's willing to just say, hey, we're done with this time section right now. We need to stop and move into the next section in order for us to get to that action orientation in 33 minutes. So part of that getting through the steps is really making sure all of our participants are prepared. And so again, in order to be prepared, you need to know what you're coming into, and you need to know what the expectations are. So we're going to start our data dialogue conversations with some suggested norms. So you might be already asking your PLCs, your collaborative teams, your administrative teams, again, anyone who you work with in a collaborative way, to adhere to some set of norms. I encourage you to think about data norms specifically to lead conversations, because the things that come up in a data conversation and data dialogue are a little different. They're oftentimes much more a place of vulnerability, and sometimes it's easy for us to get defensive or feelings hurt when we're in that state of being vulnerable. So on the screen and in your participant guide, you can see my suggestions for dialogue norms around data. The first is, I'm not going to read you the screen, but really that this is not about making anyone feel bad. I'm not blaming any particular group or teacher or group of kids, but to understand that the data is what it is, and we have to try to figure out how to interpret it. And so data really should be used here as a flashlight and not a weapon. So you can see as you read through the rest of the norms on the screen, these norms are designed to help create an expectation that we want to come into this conversation with an inquiry mind. We want to come in as a scientist or a mathematician or whatever perspective you want to come in at, to investigate and make meaning of information. And sometimes that means we have to strip off our own bias and other concerns that we have when we're having conversations. So given the dialogue norms that are on the screen, you might be thinking, well, that's great, and we might need some specific ones or additional ones for my school team, my grade level. And so I want to just give you a minute to just think about these norms. And again, in your participant guide, if you're following along, there's some space for, do you need additional norms? And so if you do, go ahead and jot them down for the next 30 seconds to 45 seconds. What other norms might you need in your school or your grade level team around data? Does anyone want to share an additional norm that you might think would be important for your team?
I will. I have a team that has at least one super opinionated person, and people tend to not contribute because that person is going to be very opinionated and they feel a little bit intimidated. So I think that there needs to be an extra norm with our group that is everybody takes a turn and we're careful not to overwhelm others with our opinion.
Great, thank you. I'm going to restate that because Julie, you were a little soft-spoken, but I think that what the norms are, everybody takes a turn because we want to make sure we hear from everybody and, you know, not to be, you know, overly opinionated, right? So don't take it personally if somebody's coming at you with an opinion, but everyone takes a turn, which I think is a great norm to add. There may be other just general norms that you use in a collaborative team that you would bring into this particular setting as well. So again, this isn't a perfect list and it's not going to solve all of your problems, but it's a good place to start when you're having conversations. So here's a tool, and in your materials, there's a quick little screenshot, especially for the facilitator, being able to plan ahead for a dialogue. So in a perfect world, you have this scheduled ahead of time and everybody knows what it is. The content here, right? So making sure that everyone understands what the purpose of the data dialogue is, what big questions we're going to answer in our data dialogue, kind of priming that cognitive pump, if you will, before our colleagues come and sit and have a conversation with us. What data needs to be available? When is it going to be scheduled? And if I'm supposed to be bringing materials and data, what is it? And then what format am I expecting it to show up in? And who's the facilitator and who's the timekeeper? So these guiding kind of questions can very easily be put into an email. Again, whether you're a grade level lead, a PLC lead, or an administrator, but letting folks know ahead of time what they're going to expect so that they can come prepared. It's not fair to expect people to be prepared and then not having done our job as the facilitator ahead of time. So you can see that the goal here is we're going to take and analyze performance data from A through F, looking for school strengths and weaknesses and where we might want to focus our areas of improvement, kind of where's our biggest bang for our buck. And if you got a chance to print out your materials, great. Again, if not, we're going to go through and use the resources that I have. So this little template is in your participant guide, and it's super easy to just, like I said, plug it into an email and send it out ahead of time so everybody has fair warning in terms of what's going to happen. So here's the big overview. There's 6 steps, and you can see each of them as we go through, for everything from relationships and kind of connecting at the very beginning all the way to closing it out based on an action orientation. And you can see that there are literally times associated with each of them. Again, we're not getting done in 33 minutes or less, which actually teams that I've been working with for a long time that get really good at using the protocol can get through the entire protocol in less than 33 minutes when they have really targeted discussions and it's regular. So again, the maximum is 33 minutes, but I have teams that I'm working with all the time that are doing it in less time than that. But so we're going to go through, and during the training this afternoon, I'm going to jump sort of in and out of the role of facilitator. So sometimes we'll actually be guiding and practicing the protocol, and other times I'm going to be setting up an explanation of the data. So we're obviously going to take more than 33 minutes to do this particular guided practice because I want to make sure that you both know how to do the protocol and understand the components of the data that we're going to work on. So on the screen now, you can see sort of the gist of what that first step is, that relationships building, which, you know, is designed to not really take more than a minute. A whole lot of it can be done before you even step foot into the room, right? Setting those expectations, using that little table that I showed you a couple of slides ago really helps to make sure so that once we jump into our conversation, it really is just making sure that everyone understands what our norms are, again, adhering and being willing to stick to them. making sure that everyone has all the materials that they need to be successful. And then if we need to, assign roles. So if we haven't already assigned the facilitator, the timekeeper, and the note taker, then we would do that here at this first section. You can see, based on what's on the screen, this isn't a get to know people kind of relationship building. This isn't chit-chatting about what you did over the weekend or an issue that you're having in your classroom. This is really bare bones. We're here because we want to look at our strengths and weaknesses using our E through F data. If you don't already have your data with you, I have materials for you to look at. I'm going to make sure that I'm leading the facilitation and timekeeper. You are your own note taker, so you've got your participant guide to do that. And just want to make sure that we're all okay adhering to the norms that we've agreed to beforehand. That's legitimately a minute or less. And now we're moving into the next step. Questions about step 1, especially if you have chatty participants. Step 1 is the hardest because it is very cold. Some might call it calculated, and it is not warm and fuzzy friendly relationship conversation. So if you want to rename relationships because you don't feel like that's an adequate representation of what step 1 is, when you roll this out to your team, you're welcome to do that. But any questions about what we're doing in step 1?
I have a quick question, if possible, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we've done this consistently at our school for a while, what is the best way to let people on your team know if they keep changing members every year about what to expect and what you're going to be doing? Because it seems that we have new people every year on our grade level, and it's difficult.
That's a great question. So at any time we have turnover, I would say before we jump into a data dialogue meeting, reserve some time beforehand to just have a conversation, if you can do it face to face. So let them know, kind of orient them to the way that your team works. This is, we analyze data. This is the process we use. Certainly if this is a structure that you like or are going to use later, you can refer to them to the video. But if you've got other resources for them to read, but trying to catch them up as much as possible beforehand is ideal, but not always possible. If you can put it in an email or even just document some of that, maybe it's just a quick little checklist that you have for new team members that you can make sure that everyone has, and you can go over that with everybody, just kind of like this we did with the norms, to make sure that everyone's on the right page. But I think most of it, honestly, it's going to be through modeling, right? Having them jump in, and maybe that first data dialogue or that first collaborative team meeting that you have, letting them know that it's okay to sit back a little bit and just watch to see how it looks. So just like we model instruction for our students in our classrooms, sometimes we need to model what a particular strategy or procedure looks like with adults. And so I would say that those are the kind of structures that I would encourage you to think about using, which you may have tried all of them because there's nothing new under the sun. But the more that you practice it and document it, I think the easier it'll be to onboard new members. Any other questions about this first step? Great, then let's go to step 2. So step 2 is the biggest section. It's the biggest chunk of time, and it's observation of data. And in the protocol, you have 15 minutes. And I know you're going to say 15 minutes isn't nearly enough to do everything that we're going to want to do. And I'm going to agree with you. 15 minutes is not enough. If what you're asking people to do is bring a binder full of data that they have only looked at maybe once before, or it's the annual binder that they look through. So the goal here is to really focus on one kind of piece of data at a time so that you have enough time to go through it all. So this is not a data dialogue process. We're not going to be able to get it done in 33 minutes if we're going to take all of the summative data from last year and try to make meaning of it. But it is enough time if you chunk those pieces of data and prioritize them and start working through them. I would say even with the data that we have today, it's a lot, and it's far more than I would normally want you to use in a data dialogue. But I also want to make sure that each and every one of you understands how the formula works so that you understand where you have the opportunity to make some important leverage moves in your school. So in a perfect world, we would have just taken one chunk of this data to walk through. But you can see on the screen, the goal here is to really focus on data observations. What does the data say? Not why does it say it? Why should it say this? What do we know about the data ahead of time? We're not trying to justify it, which oftentimes is what ends up taking so much time away from data analysis, because all of us have prior knowledge. And so we're coming in knowing that, oh, well, our scores look like that because, and fill in the blank. This is not the time for any of that because conversation. This is really just objectively observing what is going on with our data. We'll have time to talk about the because later. So in this particular section, when we're observing data, we really do want to look at trends, things that kind of surprised us, improvements or decreases that we may or may not have been expecting, but we can see in the data. And in your participant guide, you're going to see in a quick second that I've actually laid out explicit questions for each particular set of data that we're going to go through. So again, if you're looking on with your own school's report, you're going to go to that particular section of your report, and you'll see it on the screen, and try to look at the questions. So I've given you the facilitated questions that go along with this, or the ones that I would ask if I were facilitating this with your teachers or leaders. So you can really scaffold and support as a facilitator with explicit questions like this for your grade level teams or your administrative team, or you can kind of just leave it up to them to come up with depending on how proficient you think that they are. So as we jump into the sample data or your own school's data, the very first thing that you see when you look at your letter grade is the component parts. And this is the K-8 traditional school model. And you can see on the screen the top row is the total possible points for each of the component parts. And in my sample data, these are the points that the sample school earned. So again, if you're looking at your own school's results, the sample line is going to look different in terms of the number of points, but the total possible points is exactly the same. And then underneath here is the range. So the number of points or the percentages that are associated with each of the grade level classifications. So, and if you're following along in the participant guide on page 3 is the sample data that we're looking at. So just based on this first set of data, and you can see the first question that we would ask in a data dialogue is, where are the obvious strengths in your data? Again, if you're looking at your own school's data, focus on that. Which of the factors is the greatest strength in your data at this point? If you're looking at this sample data, what would you say is the strength at this school? And if you're following along with your sample data or your own school's data and you want to just share, what do you think the strength is based on just this high level?
Ildi, we had a question about the EL points, just clarifying what exactly they are
Yep, we're going to actually go through each of the individual buckets separately. So when we get to the EL section, I'll talk about how you earn those points and how you earn all of these other points. But at this point, big picture, clearly EL isn't a strength of this school. They're earning 10 out of 10 points. So hooray for whatever they're doing at the school right now based on that component. The second question on page 4 is, which of the indicators is this school showing success in? So not necessarily, the greatest strength, but where are they seeing success? I would say that K-8 acceleration readiness is an area of success. They're getting 8 out of the 10 possible points here. And while they have room to improve in both growth and proficiency, having 35 out of 50 is an area of success, right? There's, that's more than half of the points. It's well close to, earning a significant amount of the total points. So I would say that's an area of success. Again, the next thing we would want to look at this high level is, okay, so if that's an area of success, where would an area of weakness be? So relative to everything else, where's an area that this school might be kind of either struggling in or want to prioritize kind of looking at more deeply? So you might have noticed that proficiency points here is potentially an area of improvement, right? 17.13 out of 30. But K-8 bonus points, there are only 5 points here total to be had. But once we start to look at the actual components, these bonus points might be easier to earn than some of these proficiency points. So if you chose either the bonus points or proficiency points as an area of improvement, you're reading and interpreting this data correctly. So then the last kind of big question to think about at this high level is, what is it going to take in terms of number of points to get to the next grade level? And so in order to interpret that, we're going to look at the points that we're earning. So 72.22 in my sample. And then if you're using your own real data, it's going to be a different number out of whatever your possible points are. Some of you have a possible points of 100, some of you out of 90. This is a percentage, so this value is scaled. But so if I'm getting 72.22, that puts me squarely down here at the C level, but almost at the level of a B. So in order to move up 1 grade level, I only need to earn fractions of points in order to see an entire letter grade change based on the component parts. So again, you can see this whole big picture. While it's pretty aggregated, there are still some places where we know we need to investigate, and we can build some momentum with especially our school teachers and our leaders to realize that these are fractions of points compared to the number of points that we have available to us to earn. So questions just looking at the sample A through F.
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, we're looking at the total score that we need for the next grade. Some of us won't earn those other 10 points. Is that taken account into the total score?
So if your total percentage possible is 90, then it's already taken into consideration. So this percentage is applied, but it's relative to the percentage of your total points earned. So it doesn't matter whether this number is 100 or 90, this percentage is a function of your denominator. So yes, it's already been taken into consideration. That's a great question, Judy, because that's a little confusing in terms of the calculations. All right, so then let's look at the next big piece, right? So one of the areas of potential improvement is that proficiency calculation for this particular sample school. And if you're looking at your own school's data, this is kind of the next section underneath the kind of summary. You'll see that proficiency is 30% of the formula. We saw that in the kind of overview calculation. And these are the percentage of students that are counted as proficient in English language arts and in math for all of the grade levels that you serve. Now, a couple of things, especially if you're not familiar with the accountability data. So our A through F formula only holds you accountable for the students who you had an opportunity to teach for a full academic year. That's what this FAY means, so full academic year. And the full academic year is enrollment in your school based on your calendar from day 1 to day 10, so enrolled within those first 10 days. and continuously enrolled until the first day of the testing window. So what continuously enrolled means is that they haven't withdrawn and come back to your school during that time. So if students don't meet that definition, they're not included in the calculations for A through F. In the elementary model, in addition to the single full academic year, which you can see on the screen at the top, there's also a calculation of stability full academic year. And so these calculations down here oftentimes don't make a big difference in terms of the number of points that you earn, because the formula basically gives you credit for whichever is the highest of the two, the basic 1 year full academic year percentage or the higher of the stability weight. But if I'm a leader or a school leader, what this tells me is students who have been enrolled with me for 3 full academic years. So 3 years of continuous enrollment year after year. This is the percentage of their proficiency in English language arts and mathematics and aggregated all together. For students who have been with me for 2 full academic years, same definition, but 2 years in a row, this is how well that group of students performs. And again, lastly, for the students who have only been with me for 1 full academic year, how well they perform. So I can look at this from a leadership perspective, whether I'm a school leader, teacher leader, or an administrator. And in a perfect world, what we want to see is the students who have been with us the longest actually demonstrate the most proficiency. Unfortunately, that is not always the case. And so there are often times where that 3rd full academic year row is actually less proficient overall than the students who we've only had 1 year to improve and kind of impact. So depending on your own data in your school, this is, I think, just an important place to look. So questions about the data itself before we jump into actually asking ourselves, some important data dialogue questions. All right, one last piece of data that I'm hopeful that you guys have seen that's actually quite important in terms of the calculation of proficiency is the detailed summary. So being able to really get down to, and again, these are numbers of students if you're looking at your detailed summary that make up that proficiency percentage. So the number of students that make up this percentage back here. And what you'll notice in the A through F calculation is proficiency includes students who are partially proficient on our state assessment. So you get credit for every student who is in the partially proficient category, proficient category, and highly proficient category in the calculation of proficiency for A through F. The only students your school does not get credit for are the students who are in the minimally proficient category. Now, you're not getting the same amount of credit for each of these categories. They're in the formula, these are weighted. So you get 0.6 of a point for every student that's partially proficient, 1 point for every student who's proficient, and 1.3 points for every student who's highly proficient. So that's why if you're looking at these percentages, compared to any other percentages that you get from the state or your testing company, these percentages won't ever match, because in the formula for your letter grade, they're actually giving you partial credit for partially proficient students. So now, are there any questions?
We had a question here, Ildi, through chat, and the question was from Andrea. Was that 0.6 pp, 1 p, and 3 HP?
1.3 HP. So 1.3. So 1 plus 0.3. So you get extra credit for highly proficient. You get full credit, 1 point for proficient, and you get not quite full credit, 0.6 of a point, or 0.6 points for every partially proficient. And so hopefully your mind's churning now already starting. You know, we haven't even gotten to the meat of it yet, but now just kind of understanding what we're looking at, there are some things that we need to investigate. So the first question, if you're following along in your participant guide on page 5, is based on what you're looking at in your sample data or in your own school's data, what grades and content areas are you earning the most points, right? We want to celebrate the areas that are being successful, because we're also going to want to dig into what they're doing to understand how they got those data. So, but first blush is, where are the successes in these data, grade level and content area? When we look at this data, we can also answer the second question in our participant guide, which is, in which performance level are most of our students, right? So we might be getting credit for students in the partially proficient level, but if most of our students are in partially proficient, we're not getting all of the credit that we need. So understanding in which of the performance levels the majority of our students are helps us to, down the road, diagnose a plan of attack or intervention based on what we need to do. The third question around this proficiency data that I want you to ask yourselves is, in what grades or content areas do we need to see the most improvement? So just like we want to recognize where our greatest strengths are, we also want to recognize where do we need to improve the most. And so we're going to look at this high level data and just kind of spot the lowest percentages. So in this case, you can see that 7th grade math is an area that we would want to investigate further to see more improvement. 3rd grade ELA is a little lower than some of the other data points. 8th grade ELA. So we want to just identify what grades, what content areas are doing well, where there's strength, what grades and content areas do we need to improve, where are the most of our students sitting in terms of performance level. And then kind of a general question you can always ask yourself when you're looking at a particular kind of data is, are there any trends or patterns that we can see here? So can we assess kind of a pattern in the data? A pattern I see is, just generally speaking, for the most part, math scores in my sample data, with the exception of 7th grade math, are pretty high, especially in comparison to our ELA scores in those same grade levels. So math is a success area kind of overall, except for in 7th grade. And ELA, generally speaking, is an area where we want to focus our effort and our attention. So again, thinking about some trends overall. So questions about this proficiency data and some of the questions that I'm asking you to consider as you're trying to understand your own data.
In the data that you're looking at, does it show the number of students by grade level? Where is that at?
Yep, it's in the detailed summary. Thank you for asking that question. So when you are looking at this overview, in this upper right-hand corner, it says view data, and it's a little blue. And then if you're online at ADE Connect, if you click view data, it's going to take you to the detailed summary page, which is this page that's on the screen now. So this is where it tells you in 3rd grade, there were 73 students tested. 8 of them are impartially proficient. 19 of them are proficient. 5 of them are highly proficient. And the remainder are in the minimally proficient category. Other questions about the data? I know that for some of you, this is the first time that you've ever seen this information. So I really want to make sure that it makes sense to you, especially if you're going to go back and kind of work with your team on your own. All right, so then let's jump into the growth data. So growth percentile data is organized and summarized a little bit differently than the proficiency data. So on your screen and in the participant guide, starting on page 6, we're looking at kind of the details of the growth data. So the high level information about growth is here, and you can see growth is calculated for English language arts and mathematics separately. So you get separate points for each of those content areas. And what you get credit for essentially is this is last year. So if this is 2019 scores, these would have been 2018 proficiency levels. So a student was minimally proficient in 2018, and we're looking at how much they grew from 2018 to 2019 is what this data is. And growth is categorized by low, average, or typical growth, or high growth. And these are the growth percentile ranges. So 0 to 33 gets you low growth, 34 to 65 gets you, or 66 gets you average growth, and 67 to 99 gets you high growth. In the growth model, the students who are minimally proficient and making high growth, so this bottom right-hand corner, earn you 2 points for every 1 point that a student who's minimally proficient but making average growth makes. So the formula, the way this works is that this is a weighted table. Your most bang for your buck, or the most points you can earn, is growing a minimally proficient student at a high rate. You get no credit at all for your low growth students. So the students who fall in this low growth category aren't earning you any credit at all in the formula. And students in this typical growth category are earning you 1 point essentially. When I want to look more deeply, kind of by grade level, I'm going to click on that view data button similarly to the proficiency data. And now I can see for each of the performance bands that prior year by grade, what percentage of my students are falling into each of those categories. So again, now I can sort of look at just for English language arts, and then I can look at this whole same set of data for mathematics, right? Growth is independent between math and English language arts, but I can determine overall where my strengths and weaknesses are. And then if I'm looking at the details, I can go in grade by grade to see where are the majority of my students performing, in which level of growth, low, average, or typical, or high growth. So questions about the data itself before we jump into looking at some of the questions around the analysis of that data?
Why is it not showing third grade in there?
Great question. Oh, you win a prize. I don't know what to give you. I'll send you an extra certificate. So growth data starts only with 4th grade because we don't have a test that all students in 2nd grade take. So we begin calculating growth from 3rd grade to 4th grade. So in an elementary model, K1, 2, and 3 don't get counted at all because we just don't have state testing for them. Fabulous question. Then this is real enthusiasm. Sorry, I'm a nerd when it comes to data. So if we're following along on page 7 in your participant guide, you can see that similarly to the questions we asked around proficiency, we want to now start to investigate which grades and in which content areas are our students making the most growth. And hopefully you can start to see where the pattern of my questioning goes. I always want you to start with the successes. Right? It's easy to find the places where we want to improve, but if we don't find success before we jump into that, these data dialogues do feel punitive. They do start to feel like there's blame and shame and we're, trying to, pick on people. So I always want you to have a positive orientation and look for the good in your data at the beginning. Where are the successes? And they are successes maybe relative to other things, not in an absolute way, but comparatively. So where would you see in English language arts and in mathematics your most success? Where are your students making the most growth? And by most growth, I mean that they're in the high growth group or at least the average growth group. So really kind of diving in to these percentages here. And so if we're looking at my screen here, 5th grade, prior year proficient students, 26.83 of them were making high growth. That's amazing. 5th grade partially proficient students, almost 22% of them made high growth. Even down here in the highly proficient group in 6th grade, we had 13% almost that were whoops, that's low growth, sorry, wrong one, that comes next. let's see, find more fun. Oh, down here, our 7th grade partially proficient students are sitting here at almost 12%. So find your successes relative to what your data looks like. And then you might want to think about how does it compare by performance level. So based on where our students are performing on the state assessment, partially proficient, highly proficient, and so on, including minimally proficient, do we see a bunch of kids in terms of trends? Most of them are always in the low growth category, or they're pretty well spread out. Again, trying to assess where the majority of your students based on just the percentages so that we can later on come back and try to tackle some of those. Again, any patterns or trends that you're seeing in your data, it's always a great kind of general question to ask to kind of close out that piece. So half of our formula in K-8 is based on how much growth our students have made. The other half is how close their growth is to the target, which gets them to proficiency over the course of 3 years. And so that's the SGT data in the growth calculation. So the function looks exactly the same. The amount of weighted points you get is identical to SGP. And you look at it in a very similar way. So minimally proficient students who exceed their targets are going to get you the most amount of points, earn you the most points towards your letter grade. And kiddos who are below their target don't earn you any points. So in the data file that we worked on for pivot tables, you can determine how close you are to a target or how far above you are to the target in that file. So at or near is 10 points on either side of their growth percentile target. So if a student has an SGT, which is in the file, the A through F static data file, of 50, they get counted in at or near if their actual growth percentile for the year was between 40 and 60. If they have an SGT that's 11 points higher, so they actually earned a growth percentile of 70, that's way more than plus or minus 10, so they're going to be in the exceeds range. And below target is 11 points or more below their target. So organizing your data in the very same way, this is how close are students getting to the target of proficiency over time. So looking at the SGT data, you can ask yourself very similar questions that we asked ourselves around the growth percentiles. So where are the kids making the most growth to target? Which grade levels are seeing, the most students exceeding the target? Which grade levels are seeing the most students at or near their target? Which areas would we want to focus improvement, meaning kids are not on track to get to proficiency in 3 years because they are below their target. So you can see starting on page 9 in your participant guide, some specific questions that you can ask yourself around these exact data. So questions about growth to target data. Again, for the vast majority of you, this is probably the first time that you've ever seen growth percentile data and growth to target data expressed in this way. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
So if I'm looking at a high percentage in the box that is low growth and a partially proficient, it would tell me that my partially proficient children are not getting good growth.
Yes, exactly. And at this point, when we're just observing the data, we just want to make note of that. Right? Later, when we're talking about why do we think that is the case, we can start to unpack that a little bit. But at this point, we just want to make a note that partially proficient students are making low growth. And if that's specific to a grade level, 3rd grade partially proficient students are making low growth. All right, so the last kind of chunk of points that happen in the formula happen around English language learners, which I know there was a question at the very beginning, the acceleration readiness, and bonus point details. So you earn credit for English language learner proficiency and growth on the ELA. There are 5 points total in the formula, and essentially it's kind of an all or nothing. You either earn the 5 points or you don't earn the 5 points. There are proficiency calculations for students who earn language proficiency, and there are growth calculations for students who move language level. So if you start pre-emergent and go to emergent to basic, that is a growth level, and so you get credit for growing on ELA. These points are actually relative to the state averages around the percentage of students who reclassify and the percentage of students who change language levels. So that's the most kind of technically complicated section of the formula, and there's very little detail. This is almost entirely the amount of detail that you get. You can click the view data and you get a little bit more, but it's not as insightful as I know most of us want. In terms of acceleration and readiness, there are some changes to the formula which would have gone into effect for this year if we didn't have the physical closure of schools and the suspension of state testing, but they will go into effect when we start up accountability again. So I do want to share some of those changes with you. Oops. And I'm gonna, in the participant guide, they start on page 10. And I apologize, there's not a screen for all of the changes. In the acceleration readiness, you previously got credit for accelerating 8th grade students into algebra. We're no longer doing that because at high school we no longer have an end of course exam. So instead, what you'll get credit for is the students who take the 8th grade math exam. And again, in the participant guide, this is on page 10 spelled out for you. You're going to get credit for getting more than 60% of your students in the highly proficient category. If you have that high rate or a percentage increase from the previous year. So if you go back to your proficiency data and look at that highly proficient number, as long as that highly proficient number changes, increases at least 1 percentage point every year, you're going to get 2.5 points for that. If you have a really high percentage of kids already highly proficient, 60% or above, you just have to maintain above that 60%. You're also going to get 2.5 points if you decrease the percentage of students that are in the minimally proficient category in 8th grade math. So whatever that percentage is in the most recent year, then you want that number to go down. And if your percentage in minimally proficient is 10 or less, just kind of by the nature of the student population that you're working with, you don't have to see a decrease under 10. So just like we give you credit for decreasing the minimally proficient category in 3rd grade English language arts, now in the future of A through F, you're going to get credit for decreasing minimally proficient in 8th grade math at the same time that you're increasing highly proficient. Special ed inclusion is the percentage of students that spend 80% or more of their time in a general ed push-in program. And so this is relative to the state average. And chronic absenteeism, which is students who have 10 or more absences and haven't been withdrawn, or 18 absences total, or 10%. So we want to decrease the percentage of students who are chronically absent. Again, we don't have new letter grades coming out in 2020, which the absence rates would have been a little weird to calculate. So you can probably already start to wonder, well, how are they going to handle some of these things moving forward? And your guess is as good as mine. But these indicators matter in the letter grades, right? Decreasing minimally proficient in 3rd grade ELA and in 8th grade math, trying to get to a full inclusion model for your special ed students, and decreasing chronic absences. You also are going to get credit for your subgroups. So, you know, Patty said at the beginning, one of the things they're really good at is analyzing by subgroup, and then, you know, that kind of falls by the wayside. The subgroup improvement gives you a pretty good bang for your buck as well. And that really is for every group of students that you have that meet the minimum required number. All the state is looking for is a 1% increase from the prior year. So they would take this current year percentage moving forward, and as long as the percentage of students who passed started to increase, you would get credit. And you can see you earn 2 points for every group that improves over time. And then this set of points is actually capped at 6 points because there are so many subgroups that you could essentially earn all 10 points if it were just based on subgroup improvement alone. But change over time is an important part of the A through F formula, especially around subgroups, and in particular when we look at decreasing or increasing in particular areas. So questions about the function of this part of the formula?
I have a question.
Yes.
On the readiness points, we could get a total of 10, but there's more than 10 that are possible, but you'd only end up with 10 regardless of what you do.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Judy, that those acceleration readiness points are capped at 10 points. So when you look at your own school's results, you might have earned well more than 10 points, which is great, super success that we want to celebrate. But as far as the formula is concerned, once you hit 10, that's the cap. So as we're thinking about, again, on page 12 in your participant guide, you can see this set of questions that I would have you go through for this particular set of data. So in particular, I'd want you to look at and investigate, how does your ELL proficiency compare to ELL growth? Because those are calculated independently, and so you could earn 0, 5, or 10 points in that section. You could look at which areas of acceleration are earning the most points. So are you getting most of your points from subgroup improvement, or are you getting most points from the ELL or your ELL data? So really just trying to target to make sure that you're aware of where your points are coming from. Again, which areas might you want to improve, especially if you're not maxing out on your points? What are the areas that you could potentially improve on based on the data? And is there a place in the formula that you're not earning any points at all, that you should be earning points? So again, if you don't have enough ELL students to calculate the ELL data, your total calculation is out of 90 points instead of 100. That isn't an area that I would target for improvement because you're not going to have ELL results. But if there's a place where you're not getting credit, and you should because you have students in that category, that would be someplace you'd want to indicate. So, and the last big question in this section is, what area should you focus most of your effort in terms of making the most significant difference next year? And I'll stop and actually ask you all to consider that. So looking at your own data, if you've printed it out and looked at it up to this point, or kind of modeling with this data, what does your gut tell you is the place where you need to invest most of your effort, or the effort that you would invest in this particular area, saying it another way, would yield you great reward or return? And if you're willing to share your analysis with us, I'd love to hear it. if you're not sure or you're still contemplating, both of those are totally acceptable. I'd like to share with you sort of my recommendation to almost every single school that I work with on the data analysis side, to the school improvement side, to the training side. And that is that if you spent your effort decreasing the percentage of students in minimally proficient across the board in all grade levels, but essentially really targeting 3rd grade if you have it and 8th grade if you have it, that the reduction of minimally proficient is not only the most significant thing that we can do to help our students be more successful, right, which is the very most important part of all of this data analysis, is how can we get our students more successful, and moving them out of the minimally proficient category into partially proficient and above is truly life-changing. And I know the teachers on the call know that to be true. And it has the most significant impact in the entire accountability formula, right? It is a ripple effect through the entire system if you move kids out of minimally proficient, because now you're getting credit for them in the proficiency calculation, you're getting credit for them in the growth calculations, you're getting credit for them in the growth to target calculations, you're getting credit in acceleration and readiness, and those extra bonus points. You're also going to translate and see subgroup improvement points. So truly, and it seems simple and you probably thought of it yourself already, but if you just set it as a goal to decrease your minimally proficient group in terms of that percentage, some number of percentage points, that would have the most significant life-altering changes for your students and would translate into significant improvement on your letter grade.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips in that vein? So for example, our grade 3 last year had 53 students that scored a 1 in reading. And I'm a reading interventionist, and if I take 35 students at grade 3 and I'm a K5 reading interventionist, you see these numbers start playing out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm only, even with 2 IAs and a caseload of 135 to 140 students in the whole school, to move that number, you have to reallocate the scarce resources that you have, the scarce manpower and woman power that you have, and you end up neglecting the neediest of the students in order to do that. So can you talk about how to navigate those waters without feeling guilty? And then we have a budget downfall coming up. Not only does our school and our district have reducing numbers, but at the same time, with this coronavirus thing, we're going to have budget shortfalls like 2007 or worse, projected. I mean, that's what it looks like. So those are all pieces of this puzzle. And can you talk about how navigating those waters could be a little bit easier?
Yeah, Sean, those are great. That's the reality that you're dealing with 100%. So one of the things, my first thing that I would say is, if I were to think about our most at-risk students in our schools, the students who are earning a minimally proficient score are our most at-risk students. And I believe that is where we should spend a significant amount of resources. Clearly, we know that there are kids who are in the partially proficient category that are at risk too because they haven't yet got to proficient. But thinking about really what support do those minimally proficient students need, and that you can deliver with the ratios that you have and the capacity that you have within your school, will be very individualized, because as you said, it depends on how many kids and what your budget is. I would suggest that really narrowing in, once you've identified the students, to the extent that you can either progress monitor or benchmark with other assessments that are more aligned to the content standards, that give you more detail and depth about the skills deficits that they have, which I'm sure you're already doing with what you have available to you. But the difference between, on this state assessment, scoring minimally proficient to partially proficient is honestly a handful of test questions. And when we look at the resources in terms of the item specifications document for this state assessment, and we start to look at what can a minimally proficient student do for each individual standard that's kind of scaffolded to the next level, the partially proficient, I think you'll see a faster pathway to the skills that we need to build. So I'm not suggesting, obviously we need to teach them how to read and be literate and do all of these other elements. But there are concrete pathways from minimally proficient to partially proficient in the documents and materials that the state has provided for us vis-a-vis the state assessment that I think might be helpful to you when you start to target the actual support that they're getting. And offline, I'm happy to have a conversation with you and point you to those resources. But I totally sympathize and empathize with everyone who's next year dealing with students who have been both out of school and receiving variable instruction at this point and dealing with a budget deficit. It's going to be an untenable position. And frankly, why I think analyzing our data and really pinpointing where we can have the biggest impact on students first, that what we'll know is translates down the road to some accountability wins.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question. I totally understand everything that you're talking about there. This has been a battle for years that we've been doing, and there's only so much juice in the orange that you can squeeze.
Yeah.
So I mean, you try to be as targeted, you try to really micro-analyze everything, you put hours and hours into it, but then you realize that you just need more juice that doesn't exist in the orange, And so it's tough, but that's no reason not to micro-analyze and do every little thing that you can, despite the all the things that are against being able to really make a giant difference. Still put your head down, plow forward.
Yeah. And again, Sean, I'm happy to have an offline conversation around some of those resources that could help make your putting your head down and plowing through it more efficient. Because with limited resources, the time that you are spending, we want it to be as effective as possible. So there are some resources that the state provides for you that you may or may not know a lot about that can, I think, help really target at that skill level so that you don't feel like it's such an overwhelming task. It's still going to be overwhelming, but at least, again, being slightly more efficient.
Ildi, we also have I think it's a great comment and question from Carrie via chat. And she says, remember, growth is a core and tier 1 instruction focus for the teachers, and it's not just up to the interventionists to fix. And then she asks, what can we do so the number of students who need below-level intervention is reduced?
Carrie, thank you for that. The obvious, which is everyone's responsible for making sure that students are successful, not only our interventionists. Our interventionists are obviously working in tier 2 and tier 3. The core first high quality instruction is what everyone can do to make sure that we have a reduction. But high quality instruction that's really explicitly aligned to the standards and aligned to the knowledge and skills that are laid out explicitly in some of those documents that I was mentioning with Sean. Now that I'm thinking about it, we may actually end up needing to host another separate session on some of those resources, because I think the more that individual classroom teachers and grade levels of teachers understand how to use those documents as assessment documents that support the standards, in really understanding how to scaffold the learning from minimally proficient to proficient, minimally proficient to partially proficient, and so on, will make that bridge a lot easier for students. And so when we create learning targets and success criteria using those resources, I think the end result is we have fewer students who end up falling behind, and hopefully in the future, fewer students that need that tier 2 and tier 3 intervention. So I'll put a pin in my bonnet to remember that. I think that the next training is going to have to be around that set of resources. So if you haven't seen them, you understand how to utilize them in planning for classroom instruction and assessment. Let's jump into the next kind of step. And again, we're sort of ebbing and flowing into not actually doing the dialogue, but understanding the components. Step 3 in the dialogue process is really diving into where we make some inferences and try to explain our data. So when we first communicate to our teachers or whoever we're dialoguing with about the data, that in step 2, we just want to make clear observations. And we don't want to get into explanations about why the data is the way that it is. We need to let them know that there is absolutely a place in this dialogue for that conversation. And that's step 3. So in this step, we want to actually start to investigate our curriculum and instruction and evaluate what it is that we are currently doing that might be contributing to the results. And sometimes it's what we're doing to contribute to the successes, right? We want to pinpoint where we're doing things well and really understanding what's happening in those classrooms, as well as where we need to improve. So what factors, whether that's student, teacher, or classroom, again, that we can control, that might be contributing to those outcomes. So on page 12, in your participant guide, you can, or sorry, flip page 13 in your participant guide, you can see a set of kind of those scaffolded questions, one for each of these big ideas. So essentially, with your team, think about how does your curriculum contribute to these results? So back to this example, clearly our math scores were higher than our ELA scores overall, except for 7th grade. And so we must have something going well in our math curriculum in general. Right? So perhaps we don't have enough resources or curriculum support in English language arts that's resulting in the outcomes that we're getting for our students. The next question, once you kind of get through the curriculum piece, is, you know, how is our instruction contributing? So if I'm having a lot of success in a particular grade level, is that teacher doing a lot of project-based instructional design versus something else, right? So trying to unpack with our teams, what is it about instruction that might be contributing to our scores? And then we also want to understand assessment. So in the assessment questions, oftentimes it's really, do we have good enough progress monitoring assessments? Are we checking in regularly with formative assessments? But this is our chance to, as a team, investigate or wonder, you know, is the way we assess our students contributing positively or negatively to the scores that we're seeing? And then, as you can see on page 14, you know, our resources, do we have what we need? You know, do we have what we need where we need it? Do we need more data in some places? So this curriculum and instruction evaluation gets at the investigation without making excuses, right? But really just trying to analyze and evaluate what the things that we can control and to the extent that we can control them. Obviously, an underlying thread through this is budget, right? So if we realize that we don't have what we need, or resources or curriculum is lacking, or, you know, instructional strategies need to be improved, do you have a budget to fix those things as sort of a secondary piece, which comes at sort of this step 4. So based on step 2, the analysis, and step 3, the investigation around curriculum instruction and assessment, there might be some issues, real big, huge ones, like the ones that Sean was raising, that we can't answer on our own, right? It might be that we realize, wow, we don't have enough good progress monitoring or diagnostic assessments to really target our minimally proficient students. We're not going to fix that in 33 minutes, but we need to write that down so that we can figure out what our next steps are. So on page 15 in the participant guide, you can see that there's sort of a graphic organizer to help you identify what the issues are or the questions that you still might need answered, what the next step might be, and that might simply be talk to my grade level team leader, talk to my principal, you know, run this up the flagpole to the district office, and then who's responsible for it. So again, now we're moving to that action orientation. We want to know that Ildi's responsible for talking to the principal around potentially getting access to some additional assessment resources or math manipulatives for that grade level that scores are a little lower, but the teacher in, you know, another room's got a bunch of manipulatives and her scores are amazing, right? Whatever it is that we come up with in our dialogue, we need to follow through. And so making sure that we know who's responsible and holding each other accountable for that's going to be important. Questions around step 3 and step 4 in the dialogue, and these are pretty fast. All together, some people like to combine step 3 and step 4 into a 10-minute discussion around curriculum instruction, which is fine if you want to do that. I always just want to make sure that we pause and actually get to the point where we have some action orientation, which is this last kind of 2-minute wrap up of what did we figure out is an issue that we need to follow up on, who's doing the follow up.
Ildi, this is Wendy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question I have is,
Lindy, I can't, your mic is kind of coming in and out. Can you kind of either move closer to your computer and try that again?
Ildi, can you also flip back to slide 3 or step 3 slide? There you go. Thank you.
Lindy, do you want to try that again?
I'm going to try to unmute her. She's
Okay.
on mute. Okay, she is now unmuted. No.
Lindy, if your audio is not working and you want to try to type in a chat, I know that's a little harder.
Okay, Lindy's going to type it right now, so just give her a second.
Perfect. I'm going to go forward and then come back when you've got your question typed in, Lindy. So no rush. Just I'm going to go through the last 2 steps kind of as we get to it, and then we'll open it up for big questions as well. Is step 5 is leaving with a task, right? So this dialogue is focused on an action orientation. So much of our data analysis stops at the evaluation part, and then we disband because we run out of energy, time, or we're not entirely sure what to do after we've figured out what our data says. So this leaving with a task step is really important. You'll notice in your participant guide starting on page 16, it's pretty simple. It's a start doing, stop doing list, or stop doing, start doing, whichever order you want to. And it's really, what solutions might we explore? There are things that we all know, sometimes totally within our control and other times not at all in our control, that we know aren't as effective at changing our classroom behavior, our outcomes for kids, our effectiveness. And so to the extent that we might be able to stop doing some of those things, put it on the list. And if there's something you can start doing as a solution to the data conversation that you're having, jot those things down. Now, I'm not telling you that everything that goes in the stop doing list gets to be stopped right away, especially if it's something that your principal or district administrator or even the state says we have to do. But I think acknowledging what we do have control over is important. So this leaving with a task is just a brainstorm of solutions and what we can do that's both of kind of taking something off of your plate, especially if you're going to try to replace it with something new. And the last step is really just the closure. So 2 minutes kind of wrapping it up. So you can see, again, beginning on page 16, it's what am I going to do as a result of the dialogue? So if my team decided that we needed to do, consistent bell work or create a common formative assessment, who's responsible for doing that? What am I responsible for doing once I get that common formative assessment or the bell work? And in terms of who else is dependent on my actions. So if you're familiar with the professional learning communities model, the PLC model, this should feel really familiar. It's making sure that everyone who's leaving has a task to do. They know what it is, what the timeline is. And for those of us who are receiving the benefits of the things that they're working on and creating, what am I expected to do as that interdependent part of my team? So you can kind of see that closure part again as kind of wrapping it around the bow and is an opportunity for further follow-up between the data dialogue conversations. I'm going to leave it here for questions. In your participant guide, you'll notice that starting on page 17, there are a few additional extension questions. So for those of you who kind of want to go on and think through more deeply around how, based on what you've been doing this year, what you would have anticipated your scores to be, are you moving in the right direction and on the right track? There's a whole set of guiding questions there. And also thinking through if you need to make any changes to your SMART goals or your continuous improvement plan goals. There's some places inside of your facilitation packet, your participation packet, to help kind of facilitate those ongoing kind of extended conversations with your team. So Robert, do you have Lindy's question so I can make sure we circle back?
I do. So the question is, we have a meeting with K4 teachers all together and things get way out of time because there's a lot to discuss. And so question is, what grade levels would you recommend meeting to maximize the results of any meeting?
That's a great question. So I want you to meet with the people who have the most impact on the specific data you're looking at. So oftentimes that starts in just a single grade level or a grade level band. So K1, 2 might be where I start if there's meaningful data for those teachers to analyze. In the upper grade levels, right, sometimes we switch from grade level to content area depending on how you've organized yourself. So in middle school, it would be like all the middle school math teachers would get together versus just all the 7th grade teachers. Sometimes I'd want all the 7th grade teachers to get together too. So I would keep the groups small and keep them meaningful. So if you're looking at data that doesn't apply to everybody, with the exception of when you're looking at your school-wide data, which oftentimes is frustrating because it doesn't always apply. But when you're having regular data dialogues, really keep it focused on the people who can interpret and make meaning of the actual data you're looking at. Great question. Other questions, generally speaking, about either the protocol or the structure of the formula or anything else that is burning a hole in your brain?
I have a question, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Within the grade levels, I'm at a K5 school. How often would you suggest having a vertical articulation so it can go, they can focus on one skill so they won't, the next grade level won't be at such a disadvantage?
That's a great question. I think it depends a lot on when you have data that's available to you that you can articulate. So if you're, say, benchmarking in a standards aligned way and you can monitor the growth of the performance on a single standard across grade levels, oftentimes we get a chance to do that really once a year, maybe towards the end of the year or during the summer or at the summer before school starts. My general rule of thumb is if there's going to be anything that's required of teachers to do to change their practice, specifically around like an articulation from one grade level to the next, try to do that at the end of the school year, which I know this year is going to be a little weird, so that they have the most amount of time to think through what that would look like before they see students again. So again, most of the time we get that data towards the end of the year, and if it's our end of the year benchmarks or if it's our state level assessment scores, and we can articulate, if we're doing it in a more formative way, I'd love to see articulation on at least once a semester, just to kind of see what issues students are having once the school year is started and before they're transitioning into that second semester. That's not always possible, I know, with structures and schedules. Other questions?
There's a question. Let me just read the chat from Sean. Doing at the end of the year, make a video. Summer brain will zap a lot of that stuff, and that's, I think, a great comment. That's why I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a lot to handle, but I'm always, especially when we're asking teachers to change their practice, I want to give them a long lead time, right? There is nothing worse than having a really great vertical articulation conversation at the beginning of the year, and then an expectation that we go back and redesign everything within the next couple of weeks for instruction starting. That's not fair to teachers. So to the extent that we can have a discussion, document it. I love the idea, Sean, of videotaping it and having that kind of immortalize it, but then giving people who want the chance enough time to do something with it.
I have a quick question for you too. So I've been in a lot of data meetings with different kinds of teams over the last several years, and I see two things happen, and I just wanted to know what kind is the right answer, if there is one. So I see teams that will meet every week and have one goal, and they meet on data towards that goal every week until they've met that goal or until they change the goal. Mm-hmm. But then I've also seen teams that will pick a different piece of data every single week, and then sometimes they'll reflect on how that went and then move on to something else. Is there a most effective way? Is there a way that these data talks can be most bang for buck that you suggest?
Yeah, that's a great point, Carrie. When I'm coaching data teams or teachers, especially in grade level teams, and they're trying to organize their work, I like that first example, which is based on an analysis of your data, what is your priority? Or identify the top 2 or 3 things that are the most urgent or areas of focus. Create SMART goals around those and then monitor them until you complete them or need to change your goal because you realize that something isn't working significantly. I think that when you shift from one to another without ever circling back to any of them, that's when we start to lose an understanding of where we are, right? That's how, frankly, what we know happens all the time. One year we have reading as our goal, and then our scores go up and we celebrate and we're fabulous. And then the next year, of course, our math scores are low. And so then we shift to math, and then our math scores go up, and then lo and behold, our reading scores drop. That, I think, is a function of the fact that we aren't paying attention to all of the things that matter, or a small number of things that matter kind of equally. And kind of jumping from one thing to the other, I think leaves people feeling pretty frustrated, right? They can't track their successes and they can't celebrate their wins if we don't ever circle back to what we've had them work on. And so I'm a big proponent of a small number of targeted SMART goals that get monitored over whatever duration of time they are created, right? Sometimes they're quarterly, sometimes they're year-long goals, but really giving people an opportunity to see some consistency and kind of talk through process so that they can get some wins, I think is important.
Thank you.
You're welcome. On the screen right now is just a quick little 60-second wrap up. It's a strategy from Edutopia called Appreciation Apology, or AHA. So as you were thinking about the time we've had today and looking back at the intention that you set for yourself, go ahead and just reflect and close out your thinking about your learning. So something you appreciated, an AHA that you had. This is just a personal self-reflection, so I'm not going to ask you to share it, or an apology, which, if you're using this in the future with students or teachers, I always say an apology might be, I wish I asked that question that I, was burning in my head, but I was maybe too afraid to ask it. So can just close out that appreciation, apology, or AHA.
And Ildi, while people are doing that, I had another A to add for today, which is an announcement.
Oh,
and before we end, I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows that tomorrow is Ildi's birthday.
Oh my God.
And so, I just wanted to wish Ildi a happy birthday here because, we're meeting only virtually. And so I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday, Ildi. We won't tell everyone how old you are, but happy 30th birthday, Ildi, right?
30th birthday, 29th, actually.
Oh, 29? All right, perfect. So I just wanted to make sure that I wish you a happy birthday and embarrass you a little bit before we wrap up. So
thank you.
So, go ahead and virtually blow out the candle. Yes. Oh, look at that. There you go.
Thank you. That's a fabulous surprise. Well, at least we're having fun while we're social distancing. On the screen right now, last but not least, is just a QR code if you're technologically savvy, and it'll take you to our survey link. If not, you can just go back to our webpage and give us some feedback using the survey link. I always appreciate getting feedback from participants. This is my email address. If you have questions afterwards, Sean, I'll reach out to you directly so that we can continue our conversation. But please feel free to email me if you have questions. If you're on social media and you want to follow us on Facebook or Twitter, please do that as well. I try to share resources as often as I can that are appropriate for teachers and leaders. And the recording of this session, along with all the materials, will be up on our webpage tomorrow, and expect an email just in your inbox letting you know where it is and how to quickly access it. Please feel free to share that with anyone who may not have been able to join us today. And if there aren't any other questions, thank you so much. I apologize for going over a few minutes, but we had some great conversation that I didn't want to cut off. But I really appreciate everyone's participation today. I hope this was valuable and helpful and can kind of help you redesign the way that you talk about data with your teams. Bye. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.